Hello, welcome to Graphic Policy Radio at the intersection of comics, nerd culture, and social change. This is your host, Ilana Levin, and today we're talking about Thor Love and Thunder because I will jump at any opportunity to talk about a Taika Waititi movie, a comic book movie especially, and anything where there's a Guns N' Roses soundtrack. Isn't that right, Axel? Sorry, Axel's my cat, and he hasn't been actually invited into this conversation because he hasn't seen the movie, which is why I'm really excited to introduce my three amazing human guests who are bringing with them a wealth of expertise to the table. Jean is a media critic, author, and unapologetic fangirl. She's known for sharing her unique perspective on popular media on Twitter, guest appearances on podcasts, and arguing in bars about temporal paradoxes. She can be found on most social media as Fangirl Jean, Jeanne, or on her website, fangirljean.com. Welcome to the show.
Hey, hello. And hi, Axel. I'm a big fan.
Well, you know, I had originally reached out to you to talk about Thor 3 thousands of years ago, and we didn't get our timing right. So when this movie came out, I was so excited that you'd be available and we could do this.
Me too. I was so we got a second chance at this, and I'm even more excited because I enjoyed this movie so much.
I listened to you on somebody else's show talking about Thor 3. What was the name of that show?
The You Are Good podcast.
Yes. Folks should check it out. That was a great episode. Also joining me is Johnnie Jae. Johnnie Jae is the Otoe-Missouria and Choctaw founder, journalist, organizer, creator, and futurist who loves empowering others to chase their passions and create for healing and revolutionary change in the world. She's the founder of A Tribe Called Geek, an award-winning media platform for Indigenous geek culture and STEM, and hashtag Indigenous for Hope, the number 4, a suicide prevention initiative designed to educate, encourage, and empower Native youth. Jae is co-founder of Not Your Mascots and LiveIndigenousOK, as well as a founding member of the Fan Organizer Coalition. Welcome to the show.
Yeah, so glad to be here. I'm so excited to talk about this movie.
I'm familiar, actually, with some of your fan organizing work, especially with Not Your Mascots. How long has A Tribe Called Geek been around?
Oh, it's been a while. I started A Tribe Called Geek back in 2014. So it's been a long time, and I'm still in shock that it has grown the way it has.
Well, it's some really needed voices in the media landscape and if really smart people. So folks should definitely check it out. And also joining me is Jenna English. Jenna is an educator / filmmaker currently teaching film and media at a girls' school in Los Angeles. She is also a graphic designer and photographer. Her most recent project is Validation, a web series about the life and times of a parking attendant with a heart of gold. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to this conversation.
Well, this is sort of a family affair for us because I've had your husband on the show 5 million times.
Yes.
Although I've read the comics and I should have put one and one together. I didn't realize at first that Thor Love and Thunder had a big storyline around cancer. And I assure you, I would have gotten you on the podcast at some point regardless. But when I saw that, I immediately was like, I need to talk to Jenna about this.
Yeah. That's what got me, because I was like, wait, I'm not the expert on Marvel. Why am I being asked? And I was like, oh yes, there's a connection there. And I am also a huge Taika Waititi fan.
Mm-hmm.
Not maybe huge. I might be overstating that a bit, but I will see what he comes up with, because he's always interesting.
Yes.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, I like to start off our show by giving folks a quick 5 to 10 minute spoiler-free conversation around whether folks should see the movie or not. And then we're going to jump into full-on, in-depth, hardcore spoilers. So if you haven't seen the movie yet, we got a few minutes for you to listen to. We did mention one of the things we felt like folks should know going into the movie, which is that, yes, there is a major cancer storyline. I feel like, people have been divided on whether or not that's something that they have wanted going into it. So I feel like it's, people should know that this is a thing that's happening. But for folks who haven't seen the movie yet, do you feel like folks who enjoyed Thor Ragnarok are going to enjoy Thor Love and Thunder?
I would say yes. I would put a caveat on it that I think it depends on what they liked about Thor Ragnarok, because I feel like it was very much like a bridge between what is expected of Marvel, spectacle films, and then the colorful wackiness of comic books themselves, and with, Taika Waititi sprinkled throughout. And this film feels much more about, this is the wackiness that can come out of comic books. And then there's a whole heavy helping of Taika Waititi in there. And for me, like, the best way I can explain it is, when I saw Thor Ragnarok, I immediately knew that Taika Waititi and everybody involved in that were fans of the Flash Gordon movie, the one with the soundtrack by Queen.
Yeah.
Even though there was nothing in that necessarily quickly, cited to that. But then I saw this movie, I was like, oh yeah, no, they really, like, this is his Flash Gordon. This is his version of that funny, campy, rainbow painted, with all the, space adventure stuff, but with a heavy dosing of, I would say, Spy Kids. And that's my big thing of, like, if you were somebody who grew up loving Spy Kids, go to this movie, take your kids to this movie, take your family, because this definitely feels like one of the more family friendly films of the MCU. I would put it right up there with, like, the Ant-Man films of take your kids, they're going to have fun. Yeah, they might see a naked butt cheek, but for the most part, it's going to be really fun for them. And there'll be, hard stuff to talk about, but it's balanced really well to be able to have the kids have fun. And then maybe later they can reflect on some of the, sad stuff in there as well.
That's some good guidance. Thank you. Johnnie,
Yeah,
what do you think about that?
I didn't really know what to expect. I was kind of thinking Ragnarok, and I kind of went in expecting that. But there's a lot of criticism. People have said that it feels more like a parody of an MCU movie. But watching it, I was kind of confused a little bit. It seemed more cartoony. It seemed very disjointed in a lot of ways. And I was just kind of like, this is interesting. But it was super fun and I really enjoyed it. But once I finished the movie and I left and I had a little time to reflect on it, I realized, like, it is kind of a parody in a way, but not exactly of MCU. It's of Disney, because the whole movie is told like a story. You open with a chord, kind of like, gather round, listen to the adventures of Thor. So we're not watching a Thor movie. We're watching somebody telling a story about a Thor adventure. So everything seemed over the top, like theatrical. A lot of people were complaining that the costumes and things seemed very, I don't know, kind of like the Walmart version of Transformers or something, like the GoBots, I mean, that's the only comparison I can have right now. And I was like, it didn't feel like there was a level of quality I thought was missing, but then I realized it wasn't missing. It was just presented in a different way because, with Disney acquiring Marvel, it changes things. They can't go as dark as they want to in these stories because it has to be kid friendly. So you're literally watching Taika Waititi telling a Disney story. And it's very interesting to me. So, because after the movie, I'm just like, wow, like that's an actually genius way for a filmmaker to be like, look, I understand I have to make a Disney movie. It has to be kid friendly. I can't go as dark as I want. So you know what I'm going to give you is literally a kid story, which is why it opens with Korg telling kids a story about Thor. And it kind of made the rest of the story make sense. Like we see a couple of gods that were really silly and kind of didn't really make sense in this larger Marvel universe. But then you realize, like, oh, that's there as part of the story. Like, he's entertaining kids. So he has to add these characters that, are fun for kids. And then, of course, with the butt cheek mention, what's funnier than butts to kids? Because if you've seen the Minions movie,
Thank you. Yes.
Johnnie, that was like genius. And I don't think I came to this conversation with that in mind. And now I would like to subscribe to your newsletter. That is, I believe you are correct. So yeah, Jenna, what are your big picture thoughts about who should see the movie and all that?
Yeah. So I, as a fan of Thor Ragnarok, I came in, I think, expecting something a little bit different. I expected a little bit more edginess from this. And so I think for those of us, I think many of us probably came into it feeling like, okay, well, this isn't exactly what I expected. And so I think it's like either you kind of go with that and you get into this tone, or you feel disappointed. And that it's hard to say, but for me, it's easy for me to kind of switch gears and go, okay, well, this is what we're doing. It is silly. I think there's a wide variety of jokes that would make it family friendly, because from the very silly to but then to very dark places as well. And so the cancer, as well as some other stuff with kids, was also a little dark. So I would say for older kids, if you were like thinking this is family stuff, maybe a little tough for the little ones, whereas Minions might be right there with them. So that's something to think about. Overall, not a disappointment, overall enjoyable. And I appreciated the cancer storyline and the way that they dealt with it. And I know that that's, from the comic book, the way they dealt with it felt true, even though the logistics, obviously it's a comic book story. So you're like, well, that doesn't really make sense from a kind of like science point of view, but who cares, right? It still, it kind of captured, I think, the, what it feels like to be dealing with, your mortality and trying to be a hero at the same time, right? Which is what moms with cancer are doing. So I appreciated that about it.
Well, my quick spoiler-free take is Thor Ragnarok is like the MCU movie that is probably my favorite and like spoke deeply to my soul. And, I was hoping that this movie could match that, and I enjoyed it, but it didn't do that. But that's okay, because I strongly suspect that it will and has done that for some other people based on other positionality that they may hold. Like, not every movie is going to have a line that deeply resonates with the perspective of like an anti-Zionist Jewish person whose family are Holocaust survivors. Although this movie does indeed reference that exchange in it. But, I did enjoy the movie, and I think that everyone who just spoke brought some really great analysis to its sort of position, as well. And now we go full spoilers, at which point I ask Jenna, and like, seriously, guys, watch the movie and come back, here on out. Which is when I'm going to ask Jenna, like, so did you feel like as a cancer survivor, do you think it was okay how they handled Jane's death?
I think the idea, right, that something that is making you strong is killing your chemotherapy is interesting. Like, I find that to be a really interesting way to deal with cancer. I think that the main thing that I was thinking about with the end and with her death is the sacrifice, which is triggered by that, but wanting to save Thor. And of course she wants to save the whole world, but that I could see being also, it's like, she's going, oh, I have to save him, from being killed. And so let me pick up this hammer that I know is going to kill me. And it's complex, right? To make that choice, and that makes it interesting. And I also think that there's something really moving about a valiant death in that way. Because, that she knows that's what's happening to her. And there are times where your diagnosis, it does mean that. And it's all about what you do with the time that you have left. And I think it really captures that, right? Thinking about what do I do with this time I have left? And you know what? If this is it for me, I might as well just go all out, go hog. Save the world, save the universe, for that matter.
Yeah, I feel like that's I think a question a lot of people are wrestling with right now from a range of lifestyle and health challenges and issues,
Could I pop in just quickly? Because I wanted to add, obviously, I'm not a cancer survivor, but I have a sibling who is, and who still had young children at the time. And so we've had to have those like scary, intense conversations. And there was a tweet that someone, the Twitter user's name is Dragon Even Star, all one. And they pointed out that the reason that Jane entered Valhalla, and it's actually very specifically stated in a conversation between Sif and Thor about having to die in battle, is that she died battling cancer, and therefore she died a warrior's death.
Oh,
And
I didn't even think about that. I thought it was because she was in the fight, because she was in the fight, but it was also
but she comes out of the mighty Thor uniform before she dies. And so she dies battling cancer. And I remember, like, that was one of a couple of times that I cried in the movie that I'm like, I wish I'd had this movie to explain to, these young girls who were, watching their father go through cancer of like, he made it out, but also like this idea that like validating someone's fight with their illness, whatever it may be, that it is just as valid as, fighting on a battlefield. And that, I think that might resonate with a lot of people with chronic illnesses too, and disabilities, of being able to like, and give an example to have those conversations, especially with kids. And that's part of why I'm like, I think this is a great movie for kids, because there's so much flash, so many like primary color type of things happening, but underneath it, there's some really heavy things happening that once you get home and everybody's gotten through having their talks about the screaming goats and stuff, you could have those conversations about what that means that Jane got into Valhalla. What is, what was wrong with the choices that Gore made? And how, what was the choice? What's the difference? Like for me, Gore it was a very purposeful thing, I think, to introduce us to Gore and then Jane's cancer storyline before we even get into Thor's stuff, because there's a parallel between the two of them, that they both have reasons to hate God, to hate the things that, to be angry and upset about the unfair treatment that they've received. And they both react completely differently, where she chooses to save people and try to help, and he chooses to hurt. And again, like primary color, rainbows against black and white. It's such a wonderful way to kind of like take all of these big Marvel themes and make them very straightforward, but like hide them enough that, you can introduce it to someone who hasn't really thought about that stuff. In a way that's really easy to go, wow, that might not be a helpful way to respond to trauma.
Well, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say it's 100% because I have lupus and my health has been so horrible lately. So watching this movie, the feelings that come with having like a chronic illness or, having cancer, like you fight back and forth. Like it's always a struggle because you're angry, but you still want to do something worthwhile with your time. And, it's a mess of emotions. Just coming out of this pandemic, we have a lot of kids who have lost their parents and, are grappling with like survivor's guilt and trying to figure out like, okay, why are my parents not here now? And dealing with the sickness that's still around us. People are still getting sick. People are still dying. And I think coming out of such a dark period with this movie, and because of the way that I see it as being kind of like a kid's story being told, it's a great way for, it's like how an adult would try and tell a story to get their kids to understand some of these themes. It's lighthearted, but there's still this heaviness and darkness to it, but they try to break it down into these pieces that kids can easily understand and have like a reference for. So I thought that was one of the most genius things about this movie, because it just like it hit. Do you just roll with the anger, or do you roll with hope, and do you roll with, wanting to just be productive and do something good with your time? Or, it was just a whole mix of emotions. And I thought it was so brilliantly done with that storyline.
One of the things that I thought was also really important is like in this climax of the movie where Thor realizes that he's going to have to like turn to the children to help join the fight as well. And, he uses his power to empower the kids. I love the choice. Huge Guns N' Roses fan, obviously, was not surprised to see November Rain show up in this movie. But I would have guessed that November Rain would have shown up having to do with Jane's death, because you think about the whole Stephanie Seymour death and the classic music video, which is like not surprisingly, not situated in a feminist way in particular at all. But then in this movie, it has nothing to do with that at all. It starts, rather than with the beginning of the song, it starts with that crescendo of November Rain with the lyrics, "Don't you know that you need someone? Everyone needs someone. You're not the only one." So like it takes you right into the middle of this song as Thor is supercharging with the thunder, the powers of all these little kids of all different alien species, right? Like it was important. It wasn't just Asgardian children, right? Empowering them to also fight back and join in the fight, which I thought was like really powerful.
And they form a tree of life. Like that upper shot to me, I read that as forming the tree of life with his power. And that was reinforcing that theme that was kind of a jokey thing on the posters of like the one and only Thor. But there isn't a one and only Thor, because it's not about the power isn't about just Thor himself. It's about the ability. And I did see, I wanted to mention this because I did see someone, I think they were really joking, but you know how the internet can take a joke and take situations and like twist around the ideas of like, but anyway, where they were like, "Oh, Thor made them child soldiers." And I was like,
oh, God.
Okay, first off, there's a difference between indoctrination and empowerment. And that scene to me was about taking children who had literally no power, who had been kidnapped and terrified by this stranger and threatened. And then Thor gave them the power to defend themselves. It was not, I am making them an army to fight for me. And and for me, I was transported to what it would have been like to watch that as a child and seeing seeing a little girl use a bunny to blast monsters. I'm like, this man is genius.
Yeah.
Of like that anything can be a thing to help protect you and to save you. And that is a very literal metaphor that he created in that scene. And the use of November Rain, like, woof. Yeah. But yeah, like that there's so many situations in this film that are like that like it seems kind of silly unless you stop and think about like that it's a literal embodiment of a metaphor that's happening. And and I love the idea of like this is a children's story being told, or a bigger story being told in a children's story perspective. So it's not condescending at all, but it is like bright and shiny, and it's focusing on it's very quick. It's giving you information, but it's also, seeding things that might hit you later.
As far as the storytelling aspect of it, about, the whole film is bookended. And I think it's also mentioned in the middle, like that this is a story being told to children about their history, as they've been disconnected from, their homeland, if you will, or wherever,
their ancestral
home, right? Yeah. And they're being told this. Korg, who is being, kind of speaking as a griot of sorts, or telling the story of Thor and telling the story of their people, and that's at the beginning, and they come back to it, at the very end, that almost to say that this story continues. I felt like that the story's not over, but it is a story that is being told to children to teach them. And so it's almost, so that's sort of like built into the narrative in a somewhat reflexive way, or, a book, it's a story within a story. It's a little clumsy at times, but I think that if you are looking for, if you're looking at for a metaphor or for some meaning that's really there, and there's a reason why he wanted to include, this story being told to the children of Asgard.
It also was a brilliant way to be able to avoid an exposition dump that was like not going to be fun and engaging, and because it like gave us, hit the wonderful voice acting work from Taika that like it's fun and it has a lightness and it keeps people engaged. And so you just don't have this info dump. And then, they also use the tool of the play within the play. They bring that back, which is another way to make sure people understand the context of what's happening. Maybe they have forgotten the stuff from the other Thor movies. Like, I thought that was pretty genius.
Okay, I wanted to talk, especially with Johnnie, about the experience, about the presentation of of New Asgard, and especially how it links to the fact that this is a story that seems to actually be told to Asgardian children, and that in the end of the film, we're seeing them being empowered also by being trained as warriors, and seeing that new generation being, handed the tools by like Valkyrie and Sif and being trained as warriors, but also the commercialization, the tourism of New Asgard, and from like an indigenous perspective. I'm Pasifika, I'm Tongan, but I grew up in Hawaii, and I grew up around this type of like, where you're basically having to like monetize your trauma to survive because your oppressor is still like has their boot on your throat. And I saw specifically some criticism about the ice cream shop opening that has Thanos's glove. And someone said, I'm paraphrasing, that, what oppressed people would like open a shop capitalizing on the genocidal maniac that wiped out half of their people. And I'm like, have you been to Hawaii? Have you been to a luau in Hawaii? Like, you're literally like, that is participating in the, cultural genocide, because it's a repackaging of a cultural, oppressed people, so you can consume it and then like leave and go home to your life, but they have to live with that every day. So it's actually not unusual, but I especially wanted to see about like talk to Johnnie about their perspective, the indigenous perspective from a Native American point of view, since I'm Pasifika.
Yeah, I thought it was hilarious to see New Asgard so commercialized and kind of like it's treated as a tourist destination, because that's the reality that we live with as Native people here in the US. People treat our homelands like tourist destinations, and not just, like for vacations, but we see this in a lot of missionary work and volunteer work. Like they come to the reservation and, they treat it like this. Oh, look what these poor people are going through, and look what they're dealing with. And, and you have to play up with it. Like, let me just tell you a funny story. So we moved to Taos, New Mexico in 1999, and my brothers and sisters went to the Taos Pueblo day school. And so they were out on Taos Pueblo every day for school. And, they took the bus home, and there was a good, maybe like 30 minutes to an hour that they had to wait for the bus. And we noticed that my brother and sister were coming home with money. And I'm not talking like $1 or $5. I'm talking like up to $100. And my mom is sitting there like, where's this money coming from? Are you guys stealing this money? Like, what's going on? It turns out that my brother and sister and a bunch of other kids from the Taos Pueblo were literally selling rocks to tourists and telling them that it came from Blue Lake, which is a sacred lake that nobody is allowed around except for the Taos Pueblo people. But they were selling them rocks. Like after school, they would go and gather rocks, and they would stand out there by the Taos Pueblo and sell them to tourists. And depending on the size of the rock, the price went up. And, so when I saw this New Asgard, that's what it brought me back to. And I thought it was so funny.
Oh, that's awesome.
And especially seeing like the infinity cone, right? Like, I know a lot of people were like, what the heck? But I was cracking up because I was like, come on, guys. Every Halloween, Native people have to address like a lot of these Halloween special features that people do in mazes being called Trail of Fears, all these little plays, different things that are connected to Native history in terms of genocide. And they're always like, but it's funny. It's a play on words. And it's like, okay, so it doesn't make it right, but come on, guys.
Right?
Like, this is the reality that we're seeing everywhere you go. Like, there is a commercialization of, the trauma that Native people go through, and people consume it. And we have these conversations all the time that, when it comes to Native people trying to tell our history, to tell our narratives, the one thing that gets more attention than anything else is when it's dealing with the trauma. The murdered and missing Indigenous women has become commercialized outside of Indian country. We see a lot of non-Native people selling missing and murdered Indigenous women like t-shirts. They're even stealing art from Native people to sell these t-shirts. The residential boarding schools are being talked about now. And it's got people interested. And, it's one of those things where if you've ever worked in journalism, the things that sell the most are sex and death. And so when I saw all this with New Asgard, like I thought it was such a brilliant way to kind of bring that into conversation and make people start thinking about it without having to be preachy about it.
I mean, I saw the Twitter thread, like they were implying like Taika Waititi hadn't thought about how having that ice cream cone place was like having a genocide themed ice cream parlor. And I'm like, actually, it's probably the opposite. He's probably exactly thinking about it in what you said too. Which also, let's shout out to the wonderful show Reservation Dogs as being,
Yes.
Yes. Well, that's why I'm like, how do you think that a Indigenous Jewish man who played a satirical version of Hitler didn't think about the implications of the Infinity Cone? Like, come on, guys.
Everything was so intentional with that scene because, from a Native perspective, like when I saw it, I was just like, I was getting all these little references of things that we deal with every single day. And even the whole theme outside of the story of, telling these kids, like, you have power, like you can use it, and how they were training the kids at the end. Because when you see the kids at the beginning, they're playing video games. They're just in their homes. They're not outside playing or anything like that. All these kids are stolen from inside their homes, like a very sheltered existence, like where they've kind of assimilated to, this whole modern world that they're forced into, like got their cell phones, they got their TVs, video games, and they kind of forget that, there's a history, that there's there's something more that they're connected to. Like it's been kind of severed since they're no longer in Asgard. And, they're having to rebuild all that. And the kids, they don't really think about that. And that's something that we're dealing with as Native people, and there's kind of like a resurgence now where it's our youth that are starting to lead these movements of like language reclamation, of learning ways to preserve our culture in ways that are relevant to them through technology. And it's such an amazing thing to see, and to see that being put into this movie. And it was very subtle, which is what I loved about it, because it seemed very natural. It wasn't a forced narrative. It just seemed very natural, but it was very intentional. And I walked away from this movie with some of these themes that I was catching, and I was just like, how did he fit so many relevant things in such an impactful and meaningful way in a Marvel movie?
Yeah.
I think it's a really good testament to hiring diverse filmmakers. I think that this is a perfect example of why we do it, right? And it's, for one thing, of course, right, as people of color, we're making just as interesting or maybe more interesting work than our more privileged counterparts. But the layers that are possible and the way it can speak to a larger group of people, right? So taking this uber Northern European, folklore and being able to weave, different people's experiences within that, with those characters and within those storylines is something that is possible because of his experience as a person of color, as an Indigenous person, and as a mixed person, right? With two kind of heritages, with histories of oppression and genocide. So it's just really beautiful, and also sort of disappointing when people criticize him so heavily, because it does feel like there's this part of the population that they don't get it, right? Like we get this stuff, we see these things, and there are people that are not getting it, and they're the silliness.
Yeah, like I feel like Axel, who Heimdall's son, is like such a great example, and as somebody who's diaspora, of like that experience of, having your culture, but also growing up away from it in a sense, and then being kind of enamored of this other culture a lot, but still like being able to find balance in both pride in his heritage and his ability, but also getting to kind of claim, space for himself and his name, Axel, and for Thor to like accept that is his name. And then, we're cool. And I think like that's relatable to me as, a diasporous Indigenous person. I think it could be relatable to somebody who, a child who's a refugee. Like there's so many layers there. And the fact that he's a Black boy who gets to wield this power, like just genius layers. And it is amazing. I did want to mention that I was just reading today that the studio mandated that the runtime of this film be under 2 hours, which I understand. I think, from a perspective of like this being family friendly marketing, I say that with air quotes. It makes sense since kids movies are, usually around 90 minutes or so. So they wanted to keep it tight, but the amount of stuff that was still able to be fit into that runtime is amazing.
It is. And just talking about what you just mentioned, about Axel and being able to, make that space for himself and take pride in his culture and his power, that's something that Indigenous people really deal with and grapple with, because there's this saying that we have that we live in two worlds. We have a shoe in one and moccasin in the other. And there's this battle that we face, whether, are we contemporary? Are we going to be traditional? And there's a battle that you have to, like, it makes it feel like you have to choose one or the other. And the thing that I loved about this movie was that it showed that you don't have to choose. You could be contemporary, you could be traditional, you can change your name to Axel, but it doesn't change who you are. Like, he's still Asgardian, he's still got this power, and it doesn't, like, his name doesn't lessen any part of that. And I think that was such an important message for for them to show, for them to give to kids, because, we're growing up in a world where we have a more global connection. So, what does being an Otoe woman mean? What does being a Choctaw woman mean? And, and it's funny because, I'm Otoe-Missouria and Choctaw, but the way that our enrollment system works, you do have to choose. Like, you could be, several tribes, but you have to choose one or the other to enroll with. You can't be like dually enrolled. So I really love that they were showing that, because, yes, I'm enrolled Choctaw, but it doesn't mean that I'm any less Otoe. I am fully an Otoe-Missouria Choctaw woman. I'm also a geek. I could be all these things, and it doesn't lessen who I am as an Otoe-Missouria and Choctaw woman.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I liked how that in its way is also reflecting the overarching character arc that Thor's going through, which I know there's been a lot of criticism about, like, he doesn't go through character growth. I think that is a product of mishandling by other creators, and also the choppiness of how his storyline has rolled out through the various movies. But I think in this one, it really took that idea, applied it to Thor, of like, he literally is saying, like, he doesn't necessarily know who he is, and that battle is the only thing he's good for, which is super relatable to how a lot of Indigenous and people of color are, only allowed to be violent, only allowed to be one thing, and are often weaponized in that way of like, that's, and I feel that with him. I felt that with that struggle with him in Ragnarok too, of that he was being used to create a metaphor of like, of that, how white supremacy affects white people in the same, in a different way, but like with the similar outcomes to the rest of us, of that you only get to be one thing and it has to look like this. And the pains and struggles that Thor goes through is a product of only being seen as the god of thunder, and not allowing to be able to, deal with his trauma and his grief, and to and to grapple with the mistakes of his father and of his people, and trying to, like, the fact that he has to go away from his people to try to figure out who he is, and then it still doesn't really help him to figure out what he is. And that like, I liked that the story reinforced that for him, discovering who he was and becoming a hero was what happened when he met Jane, who had no power, was just doing what she does really well with dedication and was helping people. And that by that example, this incredibly powerful, quote unquote, God, alien guy was able to like understand the things that he could do and who he could become. And then he didn't have to be just one thing. And I think that it does, like the narrative, there's a lot to fit in. It's not necessarily as, as poetic, as well executed and smooth in it, but I think it still tries to nail it home at the end of like that the idea there is that it's not his powers that define him. Again, that he's more than the Thor mantle. He is a person and he has things to offer, and that he doesn't have to be just a weapon, that he could also be a guiding light for somebody. And for me, I liked the idea of like that transformation, that Jane herself functioned as a transformation of teaching him that fatherhood isn't about personal legacy, which is absolutely what Odin was in this franchise, and that its fatherhood is about being a mentor and a guide, a supporter. And that is what he ends up becoming as the movie goes on, of like less of like, I got to do this thing, and more of like, I'm going to help. I'm going to be here for you. Even though you made a choice that I didn't agree with and it's hurting me, I'm still going to support you in that choice that you made. I mean, his reaction to Jane, I loved how it was both no, but also, okay, he accepted that she made this choice and it means her death, and he's going to fight next to her. And I'm like, that like feminist boyfriend Thor.
No, it really, seriously, because it killed me when they were talking and he told her, you made me worthy. And like, cause he was grappling and, like you could kind of easily take that as he's just, trying to rekindle this romantic idea that he had about their relationship. But when you look at his whole storyline and, the struggle that he had in finding himself and learning to wield his power responsibly. Because when we first meet Thor in these movies, he's like the party guy, he's just kind of like a frat boy. Mm-hmm. And, and she taught him to be responsible, that his power could do so much more good in the world. And, so when he finally saw her again and, he told her, you made me worthy, like my little heart just like, no, don't. My tears started kind of springing forward. And I was like, don't let me get emotional over this. This is not sad. This is not anything, but like huge. But it was such a turning point when he said, you made me worthy, because he understood that, his power had, like, he wasn't using it to the best of his ability. And because he was grappling with his identity issues and, he was making mistakes, that he still understood that he was worthy enough to yield that power. And, seeing her pick up, the hammer and, do all the things that she was doing, it just kind of, I think it's further solidified that in himself that, okay, like you can be a mess, you can have all these different struggles going on and you could still choose to do good in the world. Like you can still make these choices and you still have the ability to make those choices. Cause I think with Thor, most of the time in all of the movies, it seemed like he was forced into action. He was forced to take on these roles that he didn't really necessarily know how to handle. So he was just doing the best that he could. And I really love that in this movie, he was kind of figuring it out. Like he was like, okay, I made these mistakes, but this is where I want to go from here. Like, this is who I want to be. And so this is what I'm going to try to be. And so, that one line in this movie, you made me worthy, just hit so hard for me because I was like, yes.
Can I piggyback on that, read Thor the feminist, or the film being feminist? What I really loved is that the scene, and even sort of the whole part where they're reconnecting, she literally is like she's not intentionally ignoring him. She's just so focused on what she's doing and getting better and saving these people that she's like, doesn't even know he's there, you know? And I was like, wow, this is just, we don't see that very much, right? We expect them to have this, you know, be reunited, and she comes running into his arms, and they, you know, she's missed him as much as he's missed her. And that is not at all what happens. I mean, she's like, oh yeah, okay, yeah, there you are, Thor. But,
yeah.
You know, it takes a while for him to even become worthy of her love again in the film, right? To sort of win her back, because at first she's just like, you kind of jetted on me. I've been taking care of myself, and she's just, you know, like she's not thinking about him. And I love that we got to see him go through that. Right? Being like, oh my God, I love this woman so much, and she just doesn't even seem to like see me, right? I gotta like be there for her.
Yeah, I actually thought that the use of Stormbreaker, the axe, was because, okay, so my reading of Stormbreaker's behavior with him of being jealous of Mjolnir is quite literally a manifestation of his own insecurity that resulted in the destruction of their relationship. Was, you know, he believes she dumped him, but he was pulling back the whole time because he was really insecure about his ability, quote unquote, to like protect her, that he could lose her, and that made him insecure. I'm like, I read this whole thing. Maybe I'm reading it wrong, but that was my reading of how, because she was like, no, you left first, and she didn't seem heartbroken, and she understood what was happening. And he had to come to terms with what actually broke apart the relationship, which is manifested in Stormbreaker, of his insecurity, despite all the things he kept trying to do to reassure himself that he's still Thor. It doesn't make a difference. He's still worthy of the hammer, but he's still got a problem he needs to resolve. And I'm like, you could go into like the canon of the fact that when he, you know, where he was at mentally and emotionally when he forged Stormbreaker might be why it reacts that way. But I like to think of like, no, that's really Thor embodied in the fact that he totally supports Jane having his power, quote unquote. But at the same time, he's really insecure about the fact that his power would rather be with her, and that's a struggle that men can go through and still think that they're like, I'm supportive and I'm a feminist ally, but also be still like really uncomfortable and insecure about what makes them who they are if they don't have that masculine quote of power. And I think that is the arc that's happening, that I think a lot of people don't they don't like Thor occupying that kind of space, because he, for them, embodies like the jock, physical masculinity, blonde hair, like you said, like the frat boy. And that the idea that the frat boy could actually go through that kind of transformation to share his power, and not only share his power, but be okay with someone else, like a woman taking his power, and a woman who he's in love with being his equal, which is absolutely what's happening there. And maybe even actually better at the job than he is.
Oh, yeah.
And him learning to be comfortable with that, him accepting her autonomy to make choices about her body. Like all of those levels are in that presentation of their relationship, but also his character arc in the story. And I'm like, this might be why there's people who don't know how to like interact with this Thor, because this Thor is completely subverting all the expectations you would have on what he looks like on the outside of the hard rock and blonde sex god, warrior. And yet he's, doing all these things. I mean, he is a wonderful ally who has a lesbian best friend. And
let's talk about Tessa Thompson and also her amazing chemistry with Jane Foster, which I knew they wouldn't do anything with, but was very, very palpable to me. I mean, honestly, like one of my main critiques of the movie is the lack of Tessa Thompson as King Valkyrie, but she definitely like nails every moment she's in. What were folks' thoughts about her in this movie? Jenna, do you have feelings about it?
Well, I'm a huge fan of her and the character, Valkyrie. And I liked that there was this little subtle, things about her, her sexuality. And what I appreciated was that the relationship she has with Jane is independent of Thor. And I didn't need them to be romantically interested in each other. I loved that they had a friendship based on just them kind of having the same goals, understanding they've built this relationship outside of him. And I thought it was really well handled when you realize like, oh, they're totally buddies, right? Like they got each other's backs. They have forged this relationship. And I actually, joked to my husband about how, well, it felt very much like he was like Bechdel test, check, but in a way that made sense for the story. So I appreciated that. And I think that the little nuances of her being queer is actually nice. It's nice that that it's not overly done, right? But it's almost like these wink, wink, nod, nod moments. So I really appreciate the handling of her character, but you can always have more Tessa Thompson.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Amen.
And one of the things I loved about their friendship was when they kind of show Valkyrie, they're doing these flashes of her kind of acclimating to her role as, the leader of New Asgard. And she looks absolutely bored in every scene and kind of annoyed that, this is her reality now when she's used to being in battle. And I think when Jane came along, I think, it was somebody that she could relate to, that was battling this grappling, with cancer, whereas she was grappling with trying to be a leader and trying to figure out like, okay, who am I if I'm not, like a fighter? And I think because Jane was battling cancer and because it was such a huge battle, and then she got these Thor powers and, she was able to kind of be a protector. And I think having someone around who had that same level of power and ferocity that she had, just like that fight, I think it kind of grounded her and made it a little easier for her to take on that role as leader of New Asgard. And I loved, like, when you see them interacting with each other, it's so natural. It's like they've really formed a sisterhood, that they understand each other, that, they have each other's back no matter what. And, when Jane smashes the sink because she's so frustrated that, despite everything she thinks she's doing, she's not getting better. Tessa's like, so are we going to talk about this? Just,
Right.
and it was such like she understood where that came from. And she understood, like not to push Jane. Like she didn't have to go into this, push her or force her into this big conversation about it. They just kind of understood what it was. And she's like, I'll have that fixed. Like, don't worry about it. I absolutely love that. And I like that they didn't try to force any kind of like romance between them either, because I think one of the things that that kind of annoys me in a lot of movies where they're trying to show queer representation is that they always try to force a love interest in there some way. Like they never just let that person just be a queer person in a movie. Like there has to be a reason, and it's usually a romantic reason that they're there. So I really love, like, they just let Valkyrie be. And, like there's a scene where, they're in the form of gods, and, like she goes up to grab Thor's thunderbolt and she takes a moment, to kind of flirt. And and I really love that, because it's not like she gave up the fight and she didn't lose focus of what their goal was. But, she understood like, oh, here's an opportunity. And, she did her little thing, but then she went right back to their mission. Like she didn't stop and, like, oh, like this is the girl I'm going to be in love with. And they didn't bring her back to that moment to try and force, be like, oh, well, they made a connection. And so it has to be romantic. They let it just be a flirty, fleeting moment. And she went on with her business. And I really love that, because and even with Jane and Thor, I love that they didn't really try to force them back into a romantic relationship. I like that they just let all these cards just kind of like lie where they were. Like it wasn't a cookie cutter story, like a romance story. And I really love that because, I'm asexual. So one of the things that kind of annoys me a lot is just the fact that in every single movie, there is always like this romantic notion. Like you never just let people be friends or pal around,
But I get, but the thing is like, it's also because this is a way that they can make this editable to be shown in countries that don't allow the showing of LGBTQ stuff on screen. Like if this is an indie movie where like, I know all these choices are being made by the director and writer, like I feel differently about it than I do with it being a Disney movie where I know that there's these external forces that are making it have to be in that certain way. I mean, one of the things, I mean, this is sort of jumping, but one of the things I was thinking about, I really enjoy Korg, and, him talking about his dads and, in the end of the movie, he finds this Dwayne and they're going to make a kid because this movie is, all about acquiring kids and relations with children and stuff. And they have that scene where you see them shaking hands over the fire pit. And I love that as like an origin story for where Crogans come from. I even was wondering if it connected to some other cultural mythology around where life comes from that I might be unfamiliar with. But then after I left, and I was sort of responding to some concerns that other people had voiced around queer presentation in the movie, I was like, oh, but you know what? Having babies come from a volcano and like handshakes is a convenient way to take sex out of the question of queerness which is not to say you have to have sex to be queer, because asexual people are queer. But that like, this is a homoromantic, male rock dude, and he's not there's no sex, there's handshaking. You know what I mean? So I'm like, I love it, but then I also have to think about it.
The sort of constraints that Hollywood films, going internationally or even here have, it doesn't necessarily affect the storytelling in a negative way. Like I think back to like the production code and the films of the 30s and how they figured out ways to like, metaphorically bring up sex and, kind of skirt the censors. And I think that, unfortunately, we are kind of moving into a conservative time like that now where filmmakers are having to be creative. It also creates some really interesting storytelling though, right? To Johnny's point, like it makes you have to kind of look past, okay, we're just going to have these two people in bed and think about a little bit more than that. And I think I personally, probably because I'm an educator, I feel that constraints very often lead to very like heightened creativity. So there's that side of the coin.
Yeah, I feel like the movie wasn't done any favors by, and God, like the journalist asking this, like, I don't know what their agenda was, but like, who was like asked to Natalie Portman, who I don't think identifies as queer, how gay is this movie? And Natalie Portman being like, so gay. I'm like, you are not doing yourself any favors, because people are definitely going to be expecting something that you are not going to deliver. Like, you know what I mean? I didn't expect that it would be. And certainly like, I didn't need her to say that it was, when I don't think you can say that, especially in the context of like all the other queer media that's around. But so much of the media circus, though, I was like, I almost decided to write something about this and then decided not to. When Guns N' Roses released their second album, Lies, it was all about like the tabloid media and the pressure of like this second album. They had released this like perfect first album, Appetite for Destruction. And then what's going to happen with the sophomore effort? And then, critics were like, this is not as good as the other one. This is different. And I was thinking about how, so much of the response, including my immediate response to the movie, and you guys have brought a lot out to me that I hadn't felt before, but my response to this Thor 4 was, this is good, but it's not as good as the original. I was like, is it fair to compare the Guns N' Roses album release, a sophomore release response, to this being the second Taika Waititi Thor movie response? And like, it's the complicated and undervalued second movie. But I feel like the media circus around it, I think people expected that it was going to be doing the movie big favors. And then I think it actually did not do the movie big favors at all in the end.
Right.
Yeah.
Although I do think the movie is pretty gay, and I was very appreciative about that.
Yeah. Yeah. Like, so my perspective, I'm queer. The whole issue that we hit this like as a regular cycle within online queer community discussions about media is like, oh no, this one film, only had, these no name two women kissing in the background. That's not representation. And, which absolutely is valid. I think all of the criticism is valid. I think all of the praise is valid. I think the problem is we're trying to make one film shoulder the burden for representation for an entire media landscape. And that's the problem, is that there's so few pieces of representation within a mainstream media context that we always feel that any one mention of it or showing of it is having to be the trademark quotation, the gay representation. And that's unfair. And also like that, the quote that is about Natalie Portman saying it's so gay was actually in like a premiere where it was Taika, Tessa, and her. People were asking if it was gay, and Taika's signaled to her, to Natalie, and she said, it's so gay. And they were kind of having fun with it. And I think, this is also one of the things that, the queer community, or the LGBTQ community, we have this problem where like gay means a lot of different things. Queer means a lot of different things. So some of us might think it's very queer. I think the movie is queer up and down, but that's because I'm looking at how it's queering our ideas of family, and it's queering our ideas of love. And this film doesn't show us sex at all. It shows us love in all types of varying versions of that: friendship, romantic, flirty, all family, community. It's showing love in a lot of ways. And I think it's actually more subversive if we're presenting this to children than just showing one couple kissing on screen once, versus we see two mothers concerned about their children that have been kidnapped. We see, we get a very decided, rock version of the stork story about where babies come from. And this, it's that two people who love each other hold their hands over a volcano and a baby comes out. That's no different to me than all the many varied weird stories we tell children about where babies come from. Also, I would like to mention that Court does find his Dwayne, who is a rock. I'm just going to say.
Yeah.
There you go. The Pacific, I'm like, oh, I saw that. I saw what you did.
If any listeners are aware of like a mythology where because I just feel like that's such an interesting creation of life mythology piece that I'm like, that could be from something and I'm just not aware of.
Well, there's like many different like creation stories of like powerful spirits, gods, whatnot, that are born from the love of their parents. I mean, like, was it Athena bursts out of
Zeus's head. Yeah.
So you have a lot of, so I don't think it's necessarily directly attributed to a particular mythology, but I think it's hinting to that because we're using a lot of those god metaphors in the movie. I would like also to point out, because I haven't seen anybody talk about this, and I keep like in my non-spoilery things, like hinting, watch the first movie. These are the same themes. Gods in this universe are parents. And the entire, like the whole arc of like what Gore's going through and of the criticism of the gods is talking about negligent parents. It's talking about people who were put in charge to take care of groups of people, families, who don't do that, either through negligence or just badly taken care of, and that criticism that is a big part of Thor Ragnarok, of like having to realize that his father wasn't who he thought he was, and that a lot of the damage that his father did to his people and to his culture and to other people and other cultures. And that I feel like this actually thematically is a great sequel to Ragnarok, because it's him getting to process that both as like dealing with other people who are his father's contemporaries doing the same irresponsible shit. And then him trying to like grappling with what do I do now that I've learned that my father, my family were a part of essentially galactic colonization, were terrible guardians, wreaked a lot of havoc when I was told my whole life that I'm a hero. What do I do with that? And I think what we're shown with Thor is social responsibility on a large scale mythological story is I find out that the people who are supposed to take care of everyone don't give a shit, that I'm going to take care of it myself because I know I can't not know this, which means I have to be called to action. And the fact that he learns that process from marginalized people is a really important thing too. And so I think in that thematically, he both is, it is a thematic sequel to Ragnarok, but I also think it's repeating or echoing a lot of the themes that are happening in Phase 4 MCU, which is talking about reckoning with the fact that, you know, you're part of something terrible. That's the Eternals. You're reconnecting with your family and your culture. We're seeing that with Miss Marvel. We're also reckoning with the toxic legacy of the past, which I think is actually what's happening in Multiverse of Madness. What we're seeing with Wanda, and I think there's a lot of interesting discussion about comparing Wanda to Gore. I think it's not a coincidence that they're paralleled. Their journeys of feeling that their family is a representation of their personal happiness, and then feeling robbed of that. They're making other people pay, and they're using violence as a form to gain back happiness. How if you're using violence to try to gain something that's going to make you feel good, it's going to be poisoned by the actions you took to get it. But in the end, their children end up being taken care of somebody, that they're okay and safe in their love, just not by them, and that they don't have the capacity of being that safe place for their children. So I definitely think that there could have been better ways to handle Wanda's arc in Multiverse of Madness, but I definitely think that both her and Gore are actually kind of an interesting indictment of Tony and the other fathers.
Actually, I think we need to make some time to talk about Gore and what he's trying to. I think one of the significant stories of the movie that is people have been quiet about, oddly, is the gods aren't coming to save you. Like the whole, like so much of this journey is Thor and Valkyrie going to try to recruit an army of more powerful people to come and save them, who actually are rejecting them. They don't care. The elites, as it were, are just going to party by themselves. And so it's, you know, on us to save ourselves. And sometimes that can include stealing the weapons of the powerful, like stealing the Thunderbolt, but no one's going to swoop in and save you. Feels like a pretty timely thing to be talking about.
I'd like to quickly point out that narrative of like the gods aren't coming to help you or your parents are coming to help you is a standard trope of young adult and children's stories of that the kids have to go save the thing because Percy Jackson, lightning thing, the gods aren't coming to help you. You've got to become the hero.
I was really surprised, pleasantly surprised, but just surprised that in the current climate, that this film is squarely anti-God. I mean, we don't have too many examples of Hollywood films, right? Mainstream films that are like, there's no gods, either suck or they don't really exist, or they're not what we think they are. And I mean, it really pounds that idea home. And that was almost, I mean, it's so subversive. It almost feels more subversive than, I mean, maybe it's another way that the film is queering things, right? But as Americans, that is such a no-no. And I thought, oh my God, well, he's just really like, you know what, I'm just going to do it. And I don't hear people talking about it a lot. So it seems like it kind of flew under the radar, but it was that to me was a very big deal.
Yeah.
Well, you know, it's kind of funny because, so not many people know this, but I'm actually Reverend Johnnie Jae. And I like to joke that I'm just too much of a heathen to practice, but I come from a long line of preachers. So I didn't really see the movie as being anti-God, but I did see it as more of a very subtle and I think clever way of illustrating kind of like a belief that I have. And in the way that I grew up in the church is we were always taught that as people, we are the hands and feet of God. You know, God did his thing. He created us. He's watching over us. We're all born with gifts that we're supposed to use in the world. So I didn't really see the movie as being anti-God. I thought it was a kind of like a subtle reminder that, you know, as people, it's our responsibility to take care of each other. Like, we look out for each other. We care for each other. We raise each other up. We support each other. And because so much of that is put on God, people are content a lot, especially now with the way that the church is. People are content to sit back and be like, okay, whatever happens, that's God's will. You know, and we have a lot of people speaking about what is God's will and making a lot of decisions based on their idea of what God's will is. We have to do some of that work ourselves in changing our fate. Like, that's still in our power. So I didn't really see it as being anti-God. I just thought it was more about learning our responsibilities as human and understanding that we do have a responsibility to each other, to help each other, and not really just leave it up to, you know, some God or some other entity or expect them to be always there to save us.
Yeah, he helps those who help themselves. Right. I don't know if it's on purpose, but we're seeing systems of power being paralleled with, you know, godly, or, you know, because so often we associate the ideas of systems of power as just being omnipotent and taking care of anything, so much so that we choose to acquit ourselves of responsibility for change. And I think you can see that parallel with the What If series, wherein the watcher in many ways is supposed to be us, and we're watching terrible things happen. He's watching terrible things happen. And I felt like the first season arc of that story, of that series, was that when you see something bad happening, you have to act because there is no one else. You have to act like there is no one else watching, no one else who can help. And it indicted the watcher to take action, to try to empower individuals to save themselves. And that again is being echoed, you know, here in Thor Love and Thunder, of that he has to act, but he also has to empower people to help themselves. And that is what this new era of heroism is, that we're learning and understanding through phase 4, is that it's not always going to be the Avengers to save the day. Sometimes it like being a hero is stepping aside and giving someone else the tools to take care of the issue themselves, because they better understand it than we do. Shang-Chi, like, they have a better understanding of what's actually the evil and what's the actual problem. And I might be too caught up in my own grief over the things that I wanted to do the right thing and to know how to solve the problem. And that, you know, this is being echoed again within the metaphor of gods, of that if the gods won't fix the problem, then we have to do something. And especially if we think about like that, so much of this media, like Miss Marvel especially, but I also feel like with this movie, is addressing newer fans regardless of age, but with the understanding that we have a lot of kids that grew up watching Marvel movies and are coming in watching Marvel movies. And so we're presenting a new idea of that, you could be a hero too. And looking at what that unique situation is of the rest of us. If we are the Avengers, if we are the Tony Starks and the Steve Rogers, we as adults may not have the greatest perspective on how to fix the problem. For me, my interpretation is that this is presenting the notion without a solution, of that maybe there are younger people who have a better idea of how to fix this problem because they're closer to it than we are. We may not have unlearned the problem. So like a really flat dynamic that I was talking in that Twitter thread was like Tony Stark, his arc was really understanding how wounded he was and trying to heal himself personally and his personal relationships, and almost regardless of his superhero actions, that was always his underlying motivation and arc as a character, was healing and healing himself. And what I think is interesting about what we've seen in the beginning of phase 4 is the repercussions of his choices, of like the reason that the blip remained that people had to go through the trauma of being gone for 5 years and then coming back and not just have that situation erased completely was because Tony wanted to keep his daughter. And so that one person's choice, which is also being indicted in Multiverses of Madness, of Doctor Strange made a choice about what was the actual solution to the problem. But did we ever think about why he chose that one? You know, were there other ways they could have won, but maybe not kept the world that Doctor Strange wanted to keep it at? You know, again, we had individual men with a lot of power making choices that had horrible repercussions for a lot of people that didn't get a chance or a choice in what was done. And now we're, you know, the MCU is having to deal with that with refugee issues and, you know, displacement and now terrorism that's born out of that. And so I think this is, you know, doing a lot of work again, but like this movie is, you know, addressing the idea of that, like, of that person who is somewhat embodied in Thor of like, it's okay. This is what you can do to help, but you can also help these other folks get their chance to do what's right because they know better what to do. Because that at the end of the day, that story, Thor didn't come up with the solution to the issue. Jane did.
Right. Absolutely. And that's important. I really, because of like the way they were portrayed and as being sort of decadent and I really feel like a metaphor for like the rich and powerful.
Yes.
I want to make sure we have some time to talk about the cinematography and, you know, other sort of production stuff. Jenna, did you have any thoughts about cinematography with the movie or production design?
I noticed that more in terms of just definitely very distinctive color choices that show sort of the doom and gloom. Also, the beginning, you know, with when they're introduced to Gore, where there's no brightness. It's you know, it's kind of muted. I mean, the kind of different the color choices of when like the kids are in the cage, versus the rainbows in black and white, the colors in say all the gold and Omnipotent City. And then we have Earth where the color kind of pops up.
I definitely feel like my ability to analyze what was happening in the Omnipotent City stuff was very sidelined by me obsessively looking at the beautiful statues and how great the art and production design was of that whole sequence.
The thing I liked about Omnipotent City was that for me, it felt like the bright goldness felt like a bit of an homage to Clash of the Titans, the original, like how they filmed the gods as almost being a little too bright to focus on. Like they're a little too shiny, a little gauzy. And then the I forgot the planet that he's on. That's the black and white area there. That the fact that Mjolnir brought color when it blazed to light. So it brings light and also color back. You could see that with kids seeing like rainbow power. Again, I'm a child of the 80s, so I'm like Care Bear and My Little Pony all the way. I was watching that. I'm like, this is just like the time I watched the Care Bear movie in the movie theaters as a child.
I mean, it definitely was a movie with an aesthetic sensibility that was specific, which is always welcome as far as I'm concerned. With the character design for all of the gods was really wonderful. I mean, and the flower gods from the opening scene with Gore the God Killer. I also have to mention specifically how clear it is that it is climate change that kills Gore's daughter, right?
Yes.
Like, that is a girl who is dying from climate change. That's not ambiguous. I think that's an important decision that the movie made to open with that, in fact.
Well, yeah. Well, that's one of the things that, you know, again, I just love this movie because there's so much intention, you know, like, especially given that, you know, Taika is Indigenous. There's a lot of Indigenous struggles that are put in this movie in very intentional ways, from climate change, you know, identity issues. I mean, it's so vast. Like I could watch this movie like a million times and find all these little nuances that are slipped in there. But yeah, like climate change at the beginning, like that was absolutely just blatant, you know, given that Indigenous people have been fighting so many battles recently, you know, with pipelines, with trying to get people to understand that, you know, we need to like change course, you know, that we need to protect and treat our earth as a relative. this movie is so intentional. Everything from like the colors, the costumes, the props, everything was intentionally done. And it just boggles my mind that, Taika and all the filmmakers that were involved were able to find ways to get it into this movie in a way where it wasn't garish, where everything kind of fit and made sense to where it was inserted. Like nothing seemed really out of place. I mean, it just, I don't know. I think I'm, I think I am one of those, okay, Love and Thunder is going to be my One Direction, I think.
Oh. Well, I mean, I could say you guys have all made me really want to see the movie again, which is not a thing I had said when I had left theater. I'm not a big rewatcher of things unless I really want to go deep on them. And you've really showed me a lot that I want to see.
I know that I wanted to talk about the representation at Omnipotent City, of that it was really meaningful to see a Maori goddess. And in fact, before that, Thor actually, when he's talking about the city, he lists a variety of deities from other cultures, including a Maori god. I know there's Quetzalcoatl, I think. I know Bass was sitting in front of Valkyrie and Jane. And so like it was just wonderful to just see that there. That is something that I know I've seen a couple other Pasifika people, Maori specifically, on social media who were brought to tears to see just something just so simple of just like in a hall of gods, their gods are right there. And for me, even though that's not my specific culture, I still knew it, I recognized it, and it was very deeply meaningful to be validated, or have your existence validated in that way.
So I'd heard some people say that they felt like some of that was counterbalanced by the fact that the gods aren't taking action. But I think some of the context that Johnnie brought to it about like how they're not supposed to be there to like save you necessarily,
Yes.
I can kind of balances on that. Do Johnnie, do you have any thoughts about?
I was kind of blown away by how many gods that they had represented in this movie. It made me want to be able to pause it to do like a full scan,
exactly.
to see, the scope of these gods, because you see like so many there. And, they touched on a few as they're walking by. They had the god of dumplings, which I thought was hilarious because, my partner was like, that does not make sense at all. And it took him out of the movie. And afterwards, when we were talking and we realized like, oh, this is like a children's story being told, like we're not really watching like a Thor movie. We're watching a story being told about a Thor adventure. And Bao is like one of those little funny things that you would throw into a kid's story to make the kids laugh. That's something that is very nonsensical. And that cartoony and anime.
Yeah.
To me, my reaction to that, I mean, I thought it was cute and funny and I laughed, but I also liked the idea that it presented the fact that this cartoony Bao was just in the same type of throne as any other god, that is teaching an idea that just because that didn't seem like a god to you doesn't mean that it doesn't have value to other people, including like we got to meet Korg's god, who I love the fact that Korg's god is sitting on a throne of scissors, because all the many layers of Game of Thrones reference, but also rock, paper, scissors reference. But again,
wow.
Again, like
Thank
presenting,
you.
like if I wanted to introduce the idea of religion and cultural respect to a child, I would have them come away with the idea of that what that looks like may look not only unfamiliar to you, but like something that you would see in one of your cartoons. It doesn't, but it's valued in the same way as all the others. And that's how we should approach cultures, is not that like, oh, isn't that funny? It looks weird. It's, oh, wow. Okay. That's really cool. That's interesting and different. I've never seen it before. Or it's just the same as all these other ones, teaching that like you shouldn't expect gods or culture or spirituality to look uniform at all. And again, another really subversive presentation of ideas happening in this film that seems like a joke unless you stop and kind of like think about what are the implications of somebody who doesn't carry in a lot of their preconceived notions of what this stuff should look like.
Yeah. That's really
Yeah, I was reading somewhere where there was somebody was saying that Hela was in this scene for a very brief second. And
see,
which is interesting, right? Because she was killed in Ragnarok. And so it brought up the question, like, does that mean that she survived and is going to return in a future movie?
Oh, like, I think they definitely will bring her back.
Oh, yeah. I think the Valhalla scene showed us that, you know, again, death means something different in the MCU, as we've learned with Moon Knight as well. Like, and that there are different planes of existence, which would be, you know, for some people exist as an afterlife. So absolutely. And I like, Hela is the embodiment of death. Death hasn't died yet. So I can believe she's still alive.
One of the things that I did find trouble about the movie that was a surprise to me, actually, was that it did continue some of the fat phobic jokes from part one that I kind of had thought that because the public had critiqued it, thought maybe folks wouldn't have done that again in this time. Mostly those seemed to be around Thor himself. Somebody had felt like Melissa McCarthy coming out as Hela was that, and I disagree. I thought she just like came out and was awesome, and I don't think her size had anything to do with that performance. But I do think that the jokes that were Thor and Thor's body were not, I mean, when he was heavier, were like really just unnecessary, not even funny, and like unnecessary.
I don't know. Here's the thing with that. So I'm a chubby person. I like to call myself literally the brown ball of fury because I'm rotund. And, you know, I know a lot of people have a lot of sensitivity when it comes to weight. But from my perspective as like an Indigenous person, one of the things that we do as a coping mechanism is we make fun of everything and everything about us. Like, we're very self-deprecating. So when I saw Fat Thor, I know a lot of people were going to have feelings, and it hit differently for me, I think, because I thought it was funny. But because some of those jokes, you know, when you're Native, we make inappropriate jokes about everything. Humor is how we just cope with everything. Who's making those jokes and why is it there? They're trying to make everything like universal, and there's some things that are going to slip in that don't make sense or they seem cruel. But if you're looking at who's telling the story, it's there from a different perspective. I didn't see anything like maliciously being done. I understand like the criticisms around fat phobia. It hits differently depending on your experience. I was just making a joke with a call for Echo. They put out a casting call for stickball players, and it said, must have an athletic physique. And I was laughing, and I was like, you know, athletic physique is anti-Indigenous, because what about our ball-shaped stickball players? Because we have a lot of stickball players, and stickball is all running. You know, it's very active. You're constantly going. But we have a lot of stickball players who don't meet that body standard. And
I would like those people to look at all of the Polynesian linebackers in the NFL and tell me what's an athletic physique. And like that as a fat person as well, who's from one of what is considered the fattest country in the world. I can see both sides.
Like, it's very nuanced. He went from dad bod to god bod. And I was cracking up because when we looked back at Omnipotent City and you saw all these gods, even in the beginning, the gods were not skinny. They were not very fit. Yep. Even Zeus, you know, was fat.
Right. Like, I thought that was how his armor was actually shaped that way to emphasize
like his belly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that was great. Like, we're not going to hide it. We're not going to put a girdle on it. We're just going to like, we're going to let it be there. Belly. Yeah. I agree. I'm a heavy person as well. And I thought Fat Thor was funny. I actually felt included.
Yes, exactly.
Fat Thor made me feel like, there's actually a fat hero. And it's like, and he, if I'm not mistaken, he fights fat in Endgame.
Yes, in fact, Chris Hemsworth, originally in the script for Endgame, when Thor in that end fight transforms to fight Thanos, in the original script, he was going to be turned thin in that moment. And it was Hemsworth was the one that insisted that he stay fat for that fight.
Good.
And to show that he still be a hero,
Exactly.
even though he's fat. Yeah.
To be clear, though, I don't think people are saying that Thor shouldn't be fat. I think people are saying that the problem is when you make that a source of a joke, or that's the problem.
Right.
It's who's laughing and who
Exactly.
isn't laughing and who's in control of the joke. Because I definitely, I agree that in game, while I could see myself behaving like Thor did and relating a lot to him, I did know the positioning of the lens of humor in that film was, oh, look how sad and pathetic he is.
Yeah.
And that we're supposed to laugh at him being like, essentially like the dude from The Big Lebowski.
Yeah.
Look how fatty, ha ha ha. And I think from the lens that I saw in Endgame, I could see Hemsworth being very specific in the way he characterized Thor of not being just a fat joke, but being someone who was traumatized and dealing with grief and not knowing how to process it and kind of not processing it. I really loved his performance in that. But I could also see the criticism because I saw it from like, I know what the Russo brothers are making a fat joke out of him. Because isn't it funny, the super hot bod guy that always has to be shirtless in every movie that these women like, oh, look, we're going to give him a belly to look at this time. And I'm like, he's still hot. Shut up.
Yeah.
But like this, I did like that the choice to call it a dad bod to God bod, I felt was like awareness of that. And also I thought it was actually a big part of the message that despite Thor going on this, eat, pray, love, colonizer, self-finding journey, including getting in shape, didn't help him at all. And that was kind of the point of that, like he thought that going on this journey was going to help him, and losing weight was going to help him find himself. And it didn't. And that was kind of the point of that, of like acknowledging that he started out fat and that he went through that journey and went through trying to find himself, and it didn't work either. And so,
and when it came to like him losing weight, I think, I mean, I would have preferred for him to stay fat.
Yes,
me too.
There was something I wanted to bring up that we haven't touched on. It's sort of related. But it's the ability thing. Like Thor has a disability. He loses an eye, and he has an eye in this. And that I thought was an interesting choice, because why couldn't he function with the eye? So to me, that was very ableist. And I think that stood out to me more than any fat shaming. And it's kind of the thing, the representation that we tend to forget about in films is the ability.
I was very curious about that too. But kind of going back to, it being a children's story and somebody else telling Thor's story, I think details change. And I kind of saw that, like, it almost becomes like a whitewashed version, right? When somebody else is telling your story, which again kind of goes back to like intentionality. Because I think with Indigenous people, like so much of our story, like our history gets retold, and it gets told like in a very whitewashed, sanitized, things get cleaned up. Like things aren't as horrible. Like they make it seem like we were just here chilling before colonization, and then colonization happened because we weren't doing anything with the land. So it's justified. So I was very curious about with him having eyes, because they made a big deal about that being part of, him having consequences. Like he's not invincible.
Yeah.
So I was really curious about that.
To clarify, Thor got an eye from Rocket and I believe Infinity War.
Yeah.
And I know there was a lot of criticism of Infinity War and his narrative in that movie about like kind of erasing all the work that was done in Thor Ragnarok. Been trying to find out information about why it was kept in this movie, and especially because both eyes are blue, and in Infinity Wars one was brown. The artificial eye was brown.
Yeah.
I haven't been able to find any information. It may have been something that ended up on the cutting room floor. But I do think like it is a great point, because I think that the MCU has had a really rocky reputation for dealing with disability, with Bucky and his arm, and where it's not been dealt with very well. And so I think it would have been wonderful to see him with the eye patch. Another echoing of like the legacy of that he's bringing forth from being Odin's son, quite literally. So I definitely think it's a super fair criticism, and I'm sad. I really liked him having that eye patch at the end of Ragnarok. It was really sad to not have that version of Thor, of him accepting all aspects of himself, including his disability.
As problematic as disability has been within the Marvel universe, they've been making some progress. Like we recently had an amputee, a deaf native actress who's getting her own series.
I love Echo.
A good sign of progress.
Even from the original cultural origins of that, of Odin taking out his eye and hanging himself on, like, that's the joke.
It's all like metaphors.
It's the idea of that, like the eye and perspective and wisdom and those dynamics there. But also I feel like it presents a different cultural view of disability that exists outside of what we have within colonial white supremacy, that only, and capitalism that sees anybody who can't contribute in a very specific way and look a very specific way, it has no value. While in other cultures, including cultures that are idealized by white supremacy, the idea of someone having injuries and disabilities was not a thing that excluded them from society. If anything, it was embraced as part of how our bodies change, and almost like a mark of their wisdom and knowledge. And I think that a part of why disability has such a visceral reaction from people is that while we love to have violence, we're uncomfortable with the legacy of violence. And disability, so often, whether or not it's connected to violence, it will trigger a connection to violence and people who are viewing it, of be it like amputees, be it visible differences. We see that. I did a whole thread about horror movies and why monsters in horror movies are monsters, and how they're a reflection of what is rejected by white supremacy and colonialism, and these ideas. Thank you. And that what disability, why we think that that's a monster, is that it's reminding us of violence and of our terrible, and that's why we reject. This is the issue we have with veterans too. Is this rejection of them because they remind us of the things that we don't want to think about, because we don't know how to talk about the after effects of violence. We don't know how to talk about death, which is a cultural thing. There's a lot of cultures that have very healthy relationships with death and have no problem talking about it or dealing with it.
Yeah, it's a good thread. We're going to wrap now.
Okay.
Johnnie, tell our listeners where they can keep up with your work online.
Well, you can always keep up with me on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook at Johnnie Jae. And you can also see and learn more about my work at johnniejae.com. But absolutely check out A Tribe Called Geek at www.atribecalledgeek.com. We have some great articles coming up. We have an interview with the producers of Prey, which I am super excited about.
Oh, hell yes.
I got to see the screener and
so excited.
Let me just say amazing. But yeah, so check out A Tribe Called Geek. We got some good stuff coming up, so be sure to check it out.
So that's Johnnie Jae, which is JohnnieJae. Fabulous. Thank you. And Jean, where can our listeners keep up with your work?
Well, as always, on Twitter under Fangirl Jean, and that's JeAnne. Also fangirljean.com. And I will soon be making another appearance on the podcast You Are Good, talking about Superman, 1978. Sweet. And I'll have a lot of related comments to this movie. I'm sure I'm going to try to sneak into that conversation.
Jenna, where can our listeners keep up with your work?
So JennaEnglish.com, you can view links to some of my features, and then also the web series Validation.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. And as for me, I am on Twitter a little bit too much at ELANA_Brooklyn. That's Ilana_Brooklyn. As always, we'll have more interviews with comics writers, artists, and other comics world related topics in the upcoming future on graphicpolicy.com. And as we like to say, keep it geeky.
Hey, thanks for watching the previous video from Graphic Policy Television. Just by watching, you help support our site. Thank you so much. Now, if you're watching these videos, you probably care about geeky things like movies, television, comic books, toys, games, video games, you name it. You can go and subscribe right now to our YouTube channel to stay in touch and catch all the new videos, or check out our website at graphicpolicy.com. There's a nice link on this end of the video. But as always, thank you for watching. Keep on rocking and keep it geeky.